Welcome to the Dad Nation podcast. My name's Jason Braun, co-host of this podcast, and this podcast is an extension of an organization called Dad Camp. We have a dream to see a world where every family has a great dad. Our story is 16 years old now, and we fulfill that dream by creating epic father-child experiences. And we just believe that as we pour ourselves at these experiences into fathers, that they will in turn pour themselves into their kids. And we believe with all of our hearts that when you reach a father, you reach a family. And so we have been blessed to serve dads and kids in 12 countries throughout our 16-year history. We are in 4 states. And so if you have never been to a dad camp before, go find out more at dadcamp.org. But this podcast is an extension of Dad Camp, and we've been going for several months now, and just loving the journey that this is taking us on. But we're doing something for the first time in our short history as a podcast, and that is that I am flying solo this month, just due to some COVID challenges that we're facing. We just felt like it would be best this month for me to do the podcast on my own. So I hope that you can bear with me and stick with me as I'm doing this all by myself this month. But I am on the heels of returning from what we called the Dad Camp Adventure Series. And for the very first time, again, in our Dad Camp history, we tried something new. And we partnered with an organization called Back to Basics Outdoor Ministry. It is led and founded by a new great friend of mine named Michael Battenberg. And if you are looking for an adventure for your family or for a group of any kind, I highly recommend that you check Michael Battenberg and his ministry out. They are at back2basics.com, back2basics.com. They will treat you well, and I just highly recommend Michael and his ministry. But we partnered with him, and we had a group of dads and sons meet in St. Paul, Virginia, where we spent a weekend together in the Appalachian Mountains. We did some hiking. We did some paddling down the Clinch River. We did some incredible ATVing in these razor machines that were just off the charts fun. And then we just brought our Dad Camp programming into it and had a really, really good experience. But Michael just took care of everything from the activities to the food to the accommodations, and just allowed us as Dad Camp to come in and just kind of do what we do well. And so I highly recommend Back to Basics Outdoor Ministries. As this podcast, the day of its release, the first Saturday in November, we have a team en route to Uganda. They are actually traveling today from the airport in Uganda to their destination. So even if you could just push pause and maybe right now as you're listening and just pray for that team up. We've got 6 dads, and including one father with 2 of his kids. It's Pastor Alex Falder, who was on the podcast just a couple of months ago out of Montana. He and his 2 kids are a part of this team, but just pray for them. Pray for the dads and the kids that they'll be serving. Pray for our hosts there that are helping us do 4 Dad Camp events over this next week. And then just in a few more days from now, myself and my co-host of the Dad Nation podcast, Matt Crittenden, he and his wife, me and my wife and their son, we are heading off to Kenya to take Dad Camp there for the second time. So if you'd be praying for us as well, we would certainly appreciate it. But as for the conversation this month, let's jump in. And we've been highlighting or basing our conversations around this book, The Dad Difference, by author and pastor Brian Loritz. And the book is about the 4 most important gifts you can give to your kids. And we are in the second of those four important gifts, and that is the gift of integrity. And I just want to thank Matt Crittenden and James Dix for last month's episode and giving me a chance to go and visit my daughter. But they did a fantastic job. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to last month's conversation about integrity, because we're building on that conversation today. And they just spoke just from the posture of apologies, humility, and how all that factors in when we maybe have a break in our integrity, a break in our character, and just how we restore relationship with our families. And so would really encourage you to go back and listen to that. But today, as we continue to talk about the gift of integrity, we're going to talk also about assumptions. Assumptions. In fact, the author, Brian Loritz, he says that a child's life is based on assumptions. And as I thought about that, I would argue that all of our lives, I think, not just when we're kids, but even as adults, we have and create and live from a lot of assumptions. But I want to read how author Brian Loritz speaks to this as he begins in chapter 9, I believe, of his book, The Dad Difference. But I'll read that to kind of set the tone for our conversation. He says, "A child's life is based on assumptions. My children never wonder whether they'll have a house to come home to or a bed to sleep in. They just assume they do. They don't worry about food in the refrigerator or clothes in their closets. These things are assumed to be provided. And the thought doesn't cross their mind whether dad and mom will get divorced. Like the rising of the sun, our children assume a stable marriage. These things are so much a part of their subconscious, they forecast them into their future. That's right. Ask any of my sons, and they will tell you in some way that marriage is their assumption." Now, I'm not sure these types of assumptions or having assumptions, like I said earlier, change at any point in life. For example, I too still carry assumptions as an adult about my marriage. I still have assumptions about my friends, about how my staff will work alongside of me and execute, about business negotiations, about how people will treat me. And other people, not just my kids, have assumptions about me and how my relationship with them will be. And so what does this talk about assumptions have to do with integrity? I would say everything. Maintaining our personal integrity is the key to maintaining our children's assumptions and really anyone else's assumptions. In the very next paragraph after the one that I read about assumptions, Loritz writes, "One of the saddest days of a child's life is when their assumptions get rattled." I want to read that again. One of the saddest days of a child's life is when their assumptions get rattled. That might be a sentence that you need to write down or put somewhere where you can see it in your journey to being the best dad you can be. One of the saddest days of a child's life is when their assumptions get rattled. None of us, I think I'm safe to say this, want to rattle the assumptions that every child deserves to have. Now, I am not saying that we will be perfect or ever will be perfect. That is not a standard that we can ever hold to. But I think we can always do whatever we can to protect our children's assumptions, because there is no doubt, here's what we know will happen, that the world that we live in will never fall short and destroy of destroying our assumptions time and time again. And so we as dads need to protect those assumptions that our children have of us and of our family. Because here's what happens when assumptions are destroyed. What happens is new assumptions tend to take their place. And so let me give you an example. Say trust is broken in a relationship. How do our assumptions change with that person that trust is broken with? How do our assumptions change about relationships in general, about trusting people in the future? It's one thing when it happens to us as an adult, but think about that for our kids and how our children will process this. Because here's what I believe happens. Broken assumptions or failed assumptions, they create wounds. That's how it affects us. They wound our hearts. And what happens when we have a wounded heart is that opens us up then to lies about that failed assumption. And those lies then can become beliefs or vows inside of us that then lead to strongholds. And that process then, as things these broken assumptions become subject to these lies that become vows, that become strongholds, will then strip us of joy and the abundant life that God has for us. I just heard a great message from Crossroads Community Church this past Sunday, I guess, a couple of weeks before this podcast. But if you look it up, it was October 31st. Crossroads Community Church in Kokomo, a message by Brent Faulkner. He really unpacked this in some greater detail. I'd encourage you to look at it. But this is why it's absolutely critical as fathers to maintain our integrity. Because first, we want to minimize the trauma that broken assumptions cause in our children's lives, these wounds that we will create. And then we also have to remember that when we are the cause of a broken assumption, that the wounds go that much deeper. Because as I've said so many times before, as I say at Dad Camp a lot, we say as a ministry that dads, you have the most powerful voice in the life of your child. So do whatever it takes to making that voice a positive one, knowing that when your voice is not a healthy one, that it can cause these kinds of damaging wounds in our child's life. Now, I know I'm going to use another example. I know this might be a very personal example, but it is what it is. And I want this podcast to be a place where we're just transparent about staying real and being willing to talk about difficult topics because of the goal of why we're doing this. And that's to build stronger fathers who build stronger families. So as I talk about this, no matter what side of the fence this finds you on, I just want us to be willing to see how this can affect our kids. And by no means will I address this issue as thoroughly as it could be. I'm just going to spend just a minute or two on this example. But I want this to be an example. And I hope that you can see the bigger picture of how this example is a bigger picture of the conversation that we're having, and that is to be challenged in the area of integrity and understanding of how important of a gift it is to give to your kids. But I want to use the topic of divorce as an example. The assumption that often dies when divorce comes into play is that marriages will always last. Generally, if your child is born into a situation where mom and dad are together and married, they will have the assumption that marriage will always last. And so when that changes, when divorce enters the picture, the assumptions that then replace that assumption, that marriage will always last, can be and are often devastating. I can't begin to list them all, but for those of you whose parents were divorced and you experienced that, or if you've been through a divorce yourself, you understand what I'm talking about. And a broader new assumption in our culture that has come about because of this failed assumption that marriages will always last is the widely accepted idea that cohabitation, or in other words, living together, like that's the wise choice. That it's, you know what, because marriages won't always last, that let's create a new assumption that living together before marriage is the wise thing to do, and let's give it a shot before essentially tying the knot. And it seems logical, but here's what we know. As a Christian, if you are a follower of Christ listening today, we know that it is not God's design for a man and woman to cohabitate. It just isn't the way He created it to be. And so as a follower of Christ, we know if we're going to accept God and follow him and his truth, that we know right there that that is not his design. Now, if you're not a Christian, we can just take faith right out of this conversation and still look at this cohabitation. And what we see is that it is a failed assumption. Cohabitating couples have a far higher divorce rate than couples that don't. And so, I've had the opportunity to do marriage counseling with several couples. Many have been in situations where they're living together. And I just simply try to encourage them, say, look, like as your pastor, I want you to have the greatest success rate possible. And so, you know that I'm going to come from a faith perspective, but even if you are not in a position where faith is central to your life, what I want you to hear and know is that the statistics, the research just show that cohabitation leads to a higher divorce rate. And so I just want to give you the best recipe for success. And so I encourage couples, if they are living together, to try to pull out of that situation, just because I want them to have the greatest success rate in their marriage, because this is a failed assumption of the culture that was created out of this broken assumption that marriages will always last. And then there's this host of identity issues, or as I would say, these wounds that come about that divorce causes in our children. Things like abandonment, I'm not loved, there must be something wrong with me, grief, depression, anger. I was just recently in a small group conversation with a group of dads and their sons. And one of the sons in this group was about 16 years old, and his mom and dad are divorced. And for a while, he was living primarily with his mother, and then would see his dad every other weekend, and during the week, maybe once a week. And then 7 months ago, a relational break happened with his mom. Basically, he moved out and he moved in with his dad. And what he heard from his mom was she had a new boyfriend, he had stepkids, and just in all of that, mom was kind of choosing boyfriend, and she basically communicated to him that you're not welcome here anymore. And it just wrecked him. And he was sharing this with us. He was just talking about the pain of that and the desire for him to have a reconciled relationship with his mom and his dad. And so we just, we encouraged him we said, look, this isn't your fault. This isn't even something you should have to do. But in this situation, we encouraged him to pursue a relationship with his mom, even though he said, his mom wasn't pursuing him at this point. He'd only slept there once in the last 7 months, and he was just broken about it. So we just encouraged him, spurred him on, but we asked if we could pray for him. And I am not exaggerating. As we were praying for him, he gets a text from his mom that just said, I love you, and I hope you're having a good time. And for this young man, he said, my mom doesn't do this. We haven't had much relationship these past several months. And it was powerful. He just saw the presence of God in that moment and how God was answering his prayer. And this was just a powerful story of how God is trying to bring about restoration and reconciliation. And I hope that encourages you, because God's in the details, guys. He is always pursuing us. He wants to heal those wounds, those lies, those false assumptions, and replace them with truth. And so I hope that just that story is encouraging you. But this story also just saddens me, because no child should be put in this situation. But because of divorce, his healthy assumptions of a secure, safe home where he was loved were rattled, and they were replaced with rejection and loneliness and abandonment, and all those wounds turned into new beliefs, and those beliefs turned into the stronghold of anger that was just carrying him at this time. And so remember, one of the saddest days of a child's life is when their assumptions get rattled. And sadly, this often turns into a life where our children develop new unhealthy assumptions that form the lens for which they view the world through until God can heal them of those wounds. Now, again, divorce is just one example. And guys, the big idea here is this. This wasn't a talk about divorce. This is what I'm trying to get to. Never assume you never will. Never assume you never will. Then fill in the blank. Never assume you never will get divorced. Never assume you will never break a promise. Never assume you will never make a choice that undermines your character. Never assume you never will lose your cool. And especially, don't assume your integrity. Protect it with everything you have. The assumptions your children have and the lens they see the world through are in large part due to the integrity that you maintain and give to them. And going back to the book, I loved this statement. Author said about himself, he says, "My childhood assumptions were never shattered because my dad never assumed integrity." Love that. It's such good truth. The Bible in Proverbs 25, it likens a man without integrity to a city without walls. Think about what is that when a city, when the time was written, what does that leave a city without walls? It leaves it defenseless. In other words, a man without integrity is defenseless. Gentlemen, don't assume your integrity. Fight for it. Last weekend at our Dad Camp Adventure Series, we put our programming around the book Fight by Pastor Craig Groeschel. It's a book that it's all about winning the battles that matter most. In other words, it's all about how to win the fight for our integrity. It's a book that's central, its focus is around the life of Samson, and I highly recommend you read it. You could probably read the book in 1 to 2 hours. It's a short but powerful read, and for me personally, the story of Samson is just fascinating because honestly, when you read that story, there is so much of all of us in his story. But the book was a strong reminder for how not to assume integrity, but rather the need for us to fight for it. And it highlights 3 areas that tend to bring men down more than anything else. And if we fight and win these 3 battles, we can really maintain our integrity. But the 3 areas that tend to bring men down are the areas of lust, entitlement, and pride. 3 areas that time and time again bring men down and cost them their integrity, and so much more. And so as we wrap up this discussion, I just wanted to offer some short thoughts on how we can take steps to never assuming our integrity. The first is, as I've already said, is to never assume you never will. Because the moment that we assume as guys that we never will, that is to fall victim to pride. The belief that, yeah, I can handle it. The belief that you can handle it. And guys, we know if we're being honest, that when we're in that place and trying to justify something and saying to ourselves, I can handle it, we know we can't handle it. Trust me, guys, don't go there. And so rather than think you can, live from this posture that you and we can't handle anything without God leading us and being in the center of it. Never assume you never will. The second way to never assume your integrity is to never think that you deserve it, that you deserve that possession, that you deserve that relationship. That is to fall to the lie of entitlement. The truth is that you and we don't deserve anything. The moment that we believe this lie that we deserve it is the moment that we make things about ourselves. And I think we know where that leads us every time when we make things about ourselves. So counter that by living from the posture that that we don't deserve anything, because we really don't, and that everything is a gift from God. Your family, your career, your finances, everything. And what that does when we come from a posture of gratitude is it keeps us in check. It allows us to stay humble. And when we stay humble, our integrity will remain in check. And then a third way to never assume your integrity is to never let your desire for anything other than God overtake you, because that desire is the lie of lust. And, lust can take on many forms. For men, specifically the area of lust in a sexual form is probably the most strong form of lust, but lust can take on many forms. But just think about it for a moment. Have you ever seen the lust for someone or something lead to a happy ending? Have you ever met a happy adulterer? It always costs us more than it pleases. So if you need to be reminded more about the power of lust in our lives, just check out Proverbs chapter 7. It is just a simple reminder that it is not worth it, that it always costs us more than it pleases us. And so counter this desire with the desire to want God more than anything else. Replace your I want it desire with I want God. Because in my opinion, there's no better way to protect your integrity than to pursue a healthy, growing relationship with God. Because if everything is flowing out of that pursuit, if that desire, pretty good chance we're going to maintain the integrity that we so desire to maintain. And so let me land the plane right here. This isn't just about stopping and creating a checklist and correcting your behavior, but instead, this is about going after God, letting Him transform you, letting Him form your character and building your integrity. As I sat along the banks of the Clinch River in Virginia last week, we had a couple of mornings where we just spread out along the river, fathers and sons just spread out, doing some quiet time. While I was in that time, I was reminded of this deeply profound truth about my life, and it's all from the area and in the area of boredom. And I've read this before, I've heard this before, but a bored man is a dangerous man. And the more I thought about it, for me, when I'm bored, a bored man is a frustrated man. I'm frustrated when I'm bored. And a bored man, when I'm frustrated, a bored man is a weak man. When I'm bored, that's when I found that I can become weak. And after I journaled this in my notes and I was thinking this through, I met up with my 22-year-old son who was on this trip with me, and I said to him before I said anything, I said, hey, what did, let's talk about, what we just went through, and I just want to let you talk first. And again, no exaggeration here. He says, Dad, as I thought about it, the thing that I wrote down, the thing that struck me the most is when I'm bored, I get dangerous or I get weak. And I had just journaled that myself, and it was just powerful to see how God was speaking to each of us. And it reminded me of just maybe how that is so true of all of us. And so we reminded each other, my son and I, that it's what we do to fill our time when we're bored that is critical to winning the battles that matter the most, to maintaining our integrity and to living life well. Because so often it's when we're bored and when we have downtime and there's just those moments when we're maybe alone and there's not much going on, that those lies that we're most vulnerable to start to come into our minds like, I want that thing. I want that relationship. I deserve it. I can handle it. And that's when we move in those destructive directions. So guys, gentlemen, go after God and fill your time pursuing Him and loving others, and run from everything else. Start your day on the banks of a river. I'm not meaning literally on the banks of a river. Find your place, find your river to start your day. Every single dad at our adventure series and every single son, this is one thing we all said: why don't we do this more often? Finding space to begin our day, to just be quiet and be still. I'm not saying, open a book and plow through it, or get your Bible and just plow through some reading plan to check it off your list. I'm saying starting your day in quiet, listening on the banks of a river, or just in a quiet place where you can just be listening and be still and just journal and find your direction for the day. He will give you direction for the day. He will give you direction for the next few days. And then fill some of your space with a mentor or an accountability partner. Fill some of that space during the week with someone that you can go through life with and talk about stuff with. Fill that downtime or a bored time with something purposeful, like a healthy relationship. Guys, we need that in our lives. When we're isolated and then we're bored, we get dangerous. Fill your space with people. And then lastly, in that whole piece of this idea of boredom, be on mission. Be on mission. Find out the mission that you've been created for through your work, through whatever it is. There's something that God has created you for, and get on mission, be about it, and then live by faith, open-handed, let go of the steering wheel, and carry out the adventure that God takes you on. Let Him take you. And I promise, if you do those things, you will never be bored. If you do those things, you will win the battles that matter most. You do those things and you will give your children the gift of integrity. You do those things and your children will be at peace, knowing that their assumptions about their dad and their family are unwavering. Proverbs 22:1, close with this, says, "A good name is to be desired above riches." A good name, your character, your integrity, is to be desired above riches. Our kids need the gift of integrity so much more than any worldly treasures that we could ever give them. You leave a good name and you give your family a foundation from which to view the world through a set of healthy assumptions that they were meant to have. Gentlemen, you have what it takes. When your flesh is saying, "I want it," say, "I want God." When your mind is saying, "I deserve it," say to yourself, "I don't deserve anything. Everything is a gift." And when your mind is saying, "I can handle it," remind yourself, "Oh no, I can't. I can't handle anything without God." Choose integrity, men, and go do whatever it takes to win that battle. Thanks for listening. And just please share and rate the podcast, because this is all about the reason we're doing this. We just want to encourage and build into more and more dads. And the more you share and rate the podcast, the more visibility it gets. And so you become a part of that story. This is nothing about us. This is all about together being on movement to reach and inspire and encourage dads. So let's get more dads together, and then continue to pray for our teams in Uganda and Kenya these next couple of weeks. And then if you have never been to Dad Camp and you're in an area where Dad Camp has not been, go to dadcamp.org, and on our homepage there's a heat map. And let us know where you're from, and and then we will explore the areas that are generating the most heat and explore coming and bringing Dad Camp to those areas. This is November, so happy Thanksgiving this month. Enjoy your families. Be blessed, and we hope that you join us again next month on the Dad Nation podcast. Take care.